Today we're going to be talking about how to handle chess psychology and more in particular emotions while you're playing. So today's lecture is going to be identifying and handling negative emotions during a game. So what we fear about, how to overcome that, essentially what do we do between the different rounds of a tournament so we can essentially give our best at each one of them, and more importantly how to handle the fear during or before the game. So to show you this, it will be best if I bring up some of my own experience in games that I've had the chance to play, and I've had the chance to really handle certain very negative emotions on my own. So the first one I'm going to show you is my first victory against an international master. That happened when I was very young, and it was one of my most memorable games because in the end of the day, that was round one of a very big open tournament, and I had no ability to prepare for that game. So I played on board number one against the highest rated player in the tournament, and this was an incredible experience for me that I could both learn and enjoy as best as I could. In this game I was playing black, and essentially my opponent was rated 2402. It's not a very huge rating, but again, he was one of the best international masters in my country at the time. And so I had the black pieces, so for me, just a 13 years old, it was, well, I have to admit there are grandmasters at that age, but I wasn't one of these. I was just a club player at the time, and it was a pretty intimidating experience. In fact, I didn't even know what his rating was. Perhaps that would have intimidated me even more. I've always had that sort of problem that when somebody has a big rating, I kind of get internally intimidated. Later on, I realized, and something that my dad told me, and this is that the rating does not reflect on how the player will go and play in that specific game. It means that it reflects his latest results from the previous tournaments. But in that specific game, in that specific tournament, he may not be playing at that strength. So that really relieves a little bit of the pressure. In any case, I was playing black, and my opponent started with d4, f5, and bishop g5. Now, I've always been a great fan of the Dutch defense. One of the reasons being is that it's a very different opening as opposed to most of the other conventional systems like the Knight of 6, Nimzo, Queen's Gambit, Slav, and so on. It basically guarantees black a more unorthodox yet flexible, dynamic position with some good chances of counterattacking and taking an advantage as black. Of course, it has its own flaws, like it weakens the king's side, and in case white's well prepared, maybe he can fight for an opening advantage. But certainly, I've liked it, and I always did. So, basically after f5, my opponent picked up to play bishop g5, which is a very smart way on handling the opening. If knight f6 now, white's preparing to exchange it and create double pawns inside black's position. That, of course, forces black to play g6, and in case of knight c3, bishop g7, so eventually black can prepare knight f6 as it goes. What I want to say about this is that my idea was to play the opening as simple as possible. Something important when you're playing a strong player is to make sure you can keep a solid position. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to overprotect yourself and handle every possible way on how you can complicate, but what I'm more or less saying is that you definitely wish to provide a good, solid, simple play with less of an opportunity for you to make a mistake and obviously allow him to have weaknesses that he'd love to challenge or threaten. So essentially my idea was to keep it simple. I like to play bishop g7, and then after my opponent played e4, f takes 3, knight x to d, I did knight f6. I mean, so far I knew this line by the theory, so it was pretty simple and straightforward. I just got my knight where it belongs, and things look more or less good. So I felt fine. The problems came when after bishop d3 castles, my opponent did knight f3, and I suddenly turned out of book. I didn't know what I'm supposed to do. I had no clear idea on whether I was supposed to exchange on e4 or try doing something different. In fact, I felt a little lost. It's not to say that this was necessarily a very bad position for me, but I didn't know what to do, which additionally increased my fear that I'm going to mess it up. He was playing pretty quickly, which meant that he knew what he was doing, and I had no clear idea. That just didn't feel right. So, what are we supposed to do when we ever get into uncharted territory still from the very opening? Of course, it could be intimidating and somehow fearful. However, my advice is that you pick up and do the most basic thing, and this is to consider candidate moves or possibilities. You see, it will be hard for you to find the most optimal move right away. For this reason, I suggest that you search for it by comparing a few different possibilities that relate to the main idea of your opening, or to the main idea in the position, whether you know it or not, and then consider not which one will be the best, because the truth is there may not always be the best move or the best idea you find. However, think about the one you would like to have more, and the one you would possibly like to advance with. So, there were a few different options for me. I could have played d5, I could have taken on the e4, or I could have just played a move of b6 and then potentially e6 to just do it quietly. So now, starting to compare those type of possibilities, we could see a few different things. For example, if we get to look at the move of b6, we understand that white will likely play queen e2. And again, we don't have to do very much of a big calculation. When you're analyzing the different candidate moves, the calculation doesn't have to be that long. After queen e2 and then bishop b7, I expect that white will likely castle on the queen side. And then with a very good support in the middle and potential idea of h4 to h5, I just didn't like the position in which my opponent is dominating the center, has a good development, and he's going to launch some kingside attack pretty quickly at the time. It just didn't feel right to me, and, well, I guess nobody would really like that. I mean, come on. Having h4, h5 played out is going to be fairly serious. On the other hand, of course, there was the idea for me to play pawn to d5. However, what I didn't like about it is that white was going to do knight bd2, and then essentially e7 will remain as more of a problem. It's important that when you're in a more of a challenging position or you don't know what to do, you try to compare not so much the strength of the move you're going to get, but rather its drawbacks. Because the strength is pretty apparent, but the drawbacks will help you if not to find the best move or the best idea you have, at least to find the most optimal one, and then go with it so you can increase your chances. The idea was that if I played d5, I just didn't like the e7 remaining weak. And with b6, I didn't like the fact that I'm going to stay passive while white develops and eventually gets to exploit my vulnerable king side. So all these moves just didn't really feel as good as I wanted them to. And so that just doesn't quite look good. So what about knight x to the e4 on the other hand? Well, the truth is that in case of move like moving with knight takes to the e4, white will likely recapture with his own bishop, so that's something to be expected. And so after the move of knight takes to the e4, bishop takes to the e4, I could go with the move of d5. I remember seeing an idea in a different opening where black was going to play d5, and then once white bishop comes back, there was the idea of c5 to challenge the d4 and b2. It seemed to me particularly interesting at the time because, as opposed to the other two variations, this was going to be the most active way to go. And you know, something important about activity in chess is that it's almost always good. Like when you choose something active, even if you don't necessarily know where it will lead you, it just gives you more possibilities because your pieces are fairly well advanced and more pressuring. So if we have the idea of playing d5 and c5, I thought that it may be really good to drive a nice challenge against the opponent's pawn on d4 and eventually the b2. See, that was still going to leave me with a bit of a backward pawn on e7 and somewhat not that perfect pieces like that b8 knight and c8 bishop. But you know, I wasn't looking necessarily for the perfect way to go. What I wanted to do was to choose an optimal variation that would have given me an ability to develop, eventually counter white center as much as I could, and make sure I get what is most necessary, and that is easy, solid development and good possibilities. So the thing is, I chose, there was knight takes d4. You see, fear is irrelevant. Oftentimes I like to say that fear blocks your ability to objectively evaluate the position and compare your options. The most important thing you have to notice is that the position is problematic or challenging, and that requires you to spend more time analyzing and comparing possibilities. It's good to have fear, it's good to understand the position is getting more serious, but it's not good to paralyze yourself, because that will not help. It's almost like panic in real life. If you panic in a difficult position, if a certain building is burning and you panic, you'll likely stay there and your chances for survival simply decrease. That's why we understand the situation, we understand that this is a critical situation, but that means we have to act quickly, we have to analyze our options, we have to find the best way to get out. That's the same sort of thing in chess. The fear, or basically the negative emotion, is necessary, but letting that to paralyze you into just wandering around and trying a way out of this situation it is not going to help. You have to objectively start looking at your possibilities, and likelihood you'll find something that's optimal. Keep in mind that in order for your opponent to follow up and achieve any real advantage, he also needs to play very optimal moves. And that's not often what people do. People often choose some moves that just don't continue their attack in the best way possible. And that will mean you'll be safe. So there is really no reason for risk. There's no reason for fear either. So anyway, after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, I played d5. My opponent went back with his own bishop to the d3. And of course I played c5. So my opponent castled. And I had an important decision to make. I had a couple good moves, like c4, c takes d, knight c6, even bishop g4. But how to choose? See, this is what we call a critical position. The most negative emotions for people come from a critical position. They see it, they notice a few different options, but they just don't like any of them. It's good to look at what these moves will not do. But choosing, and more importantly, evaluating the different candidate moves is essential. So let me explain to you how you can do it more effectively yourself. First of all, what happens with the simplest move? So yes, I suggest that you start with the very simple move you've got. Don't start with the complicated one. Start with the simple one. If you can calculate the simpler one and you know what they will lead to, you will be left only with the more complex to find. And if whatever you don't like about the complicated one, or you realize that it just wouldn't give you as good result or the same sort of achievement that a simpler line provides you, it's going to save you a long time because you'll just cut it off and you wouldn't be going any much further. The problem is that most chess players start with the complicated lines and they get too deep into them, while there is a much simpler solution that does more and achieves more in the position. So for this reason, I recommend you to start always with the simple line. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what goes on in the position of the c takes d. So I started obviously with this type of calculation because it's apparent. Taking the pawn looks delicious. The thing is, after I take the pawn, white was going to play with rook e1. And likely, if I do knight c6 in the position, we could very easily realize that white will do bishop b5, applying both pressure against both my c6 pawn knight and the pawn there, with the potential idea of exchanging c6 and taking d5, d4, was really not what I loved. I mean, it's not to say that I will necessarily lose because of it, but come on, let's face it, this is just not a great position. The pressure that I was going to have to experience and the fact that I just didn't have a whole lot of backup and preparation, that is killing. It's like, it just doesn't look good. It's not to say that black will necessarily lose, but you can understand why that's just not cool. So I thought, okay, c takes to the d doesn't give me so much more. I can play c4. Although in that case, if I do it this way, white bishop will come back and my pressure is lost. So objectively, White will do c3 on the very next move. He will easily regroup his pieces by making h3, rook e1, and potentially bishop f1. I'll have to stay with the e7 pawn, and yeah, I don't suppose I'll have such a horrible position or a lot of things to be worried about, and yet I'm not a great fan of just losing my tension. After all, the whole idea was to keep the pressure on and provide myself with more possibilities, and just it will not work as nicely or as easily at this point. So I didn't like that either. See, the important thing is not to calculate too long. Okay, if the risk is bigger, obviously you will need to calculate a little bit longer to make sure whatever you analyze is true. However, it is more about calculating and analyzing how the position changes. Yeah, the different imbalances in the position will give you a much better idea on how the position changes and what you can expect of a given line, rather than a lengthier variation that probably wouldn't be too precise or too correct, because again, the further you go into the line, the more moves can change, the more the position can change, and so you can hardly predict that. Yet the ideas remain the same. So if you're aware of the ideas and what you can rely on, what you can expect, that will probably do better, and you'll get a lot better idea and understanding on as to what you can expect and what's going to happen in a specific line or variation. So I didn't like the c4. I didn't enjoy the c6 to the d as much as I thought I would. So what about a move of bishop g4? I mean, white is obviously going to do bishop e2 in this case, and I thought that in case of bishop takes f, maybe that pawn could fall. Unfortunately, white has c4. So you see, something I like to do is, because it looked so good for me, instead of doing what a lot of the other chess players tend to do, which is to basically look at all the best things that happen for them, I didn't want to do that, and instead what I wanted to do was to think about what my opponent was going to achieve. What was he going to get for this? Was he going to get any attacks? Was he going to get any real threats? Was he going to attack me over here or over there? It was really a bit of a challenge for me, because he had so many different things, and yet I was looking at the ones that will pose a problem. You see, it's not nice, okay? It is not super pleasant to look at what he can do and find exactly the different challenges he will make. But in a way, it is necessary, because this is an objective analysis. Thinking about what he can do, what sort of threats or problems he can pose against you. It's a very needed thing. So I slotted c4, and it turns out that despite the material, black would have to endure a lot of pressure around the center and the queen side. So I didn't like that one either. So finally we're left with knight c6. When I started calculating knight c6, I didn't know what to expect from this line, because that wasn't my original thought. Yet we can easily understand that after d takes to the c, black can capture b2, and the moment white's rook moves away, this bishop can quickly come to c3 or even g7, and everything feels more or less safe. White no longer has rook e1, because the bishop will be controlling this square, so no more pressure on e7. It's a pretty easy development and control or support around the middle. So I knew, even though this line may not necessarily give me a big advantage or anything great, I'm going to have a fair control, an easy development, and more importantly, a good way to back up my center and the other possibilities. It was an interesting thought, because again, even though knight c6 wasn't expected by me, it just looks the most optimal variation in comparison to all the other moves I have available. Of course, after rook e1, I had the possibility to play instead of c6, bishop g4, and then we realized that the same type of line could work. Bishop c3 can come down next, so it feels good. White took on c5, and then after rook b1, I came back to g7. Sure, rook e1 is possible, but it's not going to create any threat on the e7, because I can quickly move my queen and my knight supporting the pawn. So White tried c4. Then I had another position. What do I do here? You see, most people panic when they get into a situation where they don't know what to do. I recommend you figure out a plan. Oftentimes, plan is the other word for figuring out a kind of goal in the right area of the board where you can follow it. My idea was all alone in one thing. I couldn't allow myself to defend here because I was going to lose the initiative. So my only goal could be to try and play faster and create threats. The moment I noticed this, I said everything will go towards the center and eventually the king's side. So the best candidate moves begin with bishop g4, threatening to double white's pawns, then bishop f5, which hit his rook. And more importantly, of course, he had to move the rook away, taking the pawn, d4. The best of all things is that at this point I was in control. And that's the last thing I would like to talk about. What means to be in control? Being in control means that you know what's going on. You can predict exactly how the pawn structure and the piece formation is going to go. And all you need in order to achieve such confident analysis and control, as I say, is to calculate a few moves ahead and make sure that you're left with no major weaknesses and a pretty good idea on how you'll advance further. In this position, I knew that my queen was going to go away next move and I was going to do e5. The details will be eventually formed later. Right now, though, the plan is clear. Challenging the rook, I was going to challenge the bishop, and then after a little bit of restriction so he doesn't move his own bishop and I could make some threats, essentially I played e5, knowing that there is no weakness that white can exploit, yet my pawn avalanche was going, and soon after I was able to transform it into a very successful advantage. But this is an interesting point to see how I was able to handle the part of the game where I felt most uncomfortable, the early opening to early middle game, and how I was able to handle these problems in order to achieve a decent game against a very strong master. I hope that my advice will help you to be more confident in similar situations, and make sure that you never panic. Panicking or being fearful about the possible consequences is not going to help you to figure out the right candidates and take on the most optimal decision. One of the most important things, and this is identifying the negative emotions during the game depending on how it changes. You see, this is important because if you know exactly how to identify these, you can find out all the key aspects, all the key ideas, and that really matters. So let's begin. Let us actually get started with the game that was actually played in the first American Congress in New York, 1857, between Louis Paulson and Paul Morphy. This is a very classical game, very classy at the same time. And let's actually talk about what were the key things that made white lose this game. Although I obviously didn't have a chance to talk with any of those players. They were living in the 19th century and I wasn't born at the time. It's still kind of interesting to see how the different moments affect players' decisions. So essentially the fear of certain possibilities and the fear of the consequences it really made black very successful out there. So let's take a look and see what happened in the game. It began with the moves of e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then knight c3, knight f6, and bishop to b5. So actually after the move of bishop to the b5, black played bishop c5. Now, a lot of players know that this is not a very good line because bishop b4 is much more serious. It's a line that helps black to apply certain challenge against the white knight on c3. It also, actually, we could say, prevents anything complicated. Like, otherwise, white can do knight x d5 and d4. It is a very common idea that knight x d5 and then d4 provides white with a great control in the center, and despite black's ability to stay safe and defend, it's just still not very good. It's still really not that awesome. So this is just one of the options, of course, yet you see, that's why people don't play bishop b4. I mean, this is the way to understand it. It was an old game. Anyway, black played bishop to c5 instead, and of course, back at the time, the idea with knight x d5, or most of the modern chess theory, was not, common, so people didn't know that it actually gets to exist. So what happened after that move was that white played short castles, and then black played short castle too. Knight takes d5. In fact, white saw the possibility. I mean, Louis Paulsen, as I think his name was, knew very well that the main goal of this lot variation of that plan is all about this idea. Let's just counter in the center. Let's threaten and keep up with the pressure. It's a very, very good idea. I mean, it's not to say that it's absolutely perfect, but, you know, that's what he would like to do. He'd like to challenge, he'd like to advance, he'd like to attack, and with knight x to the e5 on the line, things seem pretty good. So he was able to discover that idea. Even with a move later, it still works out pretty well. Now, after that move, black played rook e8. This is a very interesting suggestion. So what is going on after the move of rook to the e8? Let's see. After the move of rook e8, black is trying to use the possibility of getting the initiative. Now, I want you to pay very important attention to what I'm just going to say. When some player loses material, almost instantly, the opponent starts thinking, you know what? This is going to be my chance. I have everything. I have the advantage. I have the possibilities. I get the super great idea. I can do this. I can do that. And people almost forget that winning material is not the end of the game. Winning material allows the opponent oftentimes to take over the initiative and create quite a few threats. Now, with that mindset, you need to know that you'll be on the back foot for a while, and you need to discover the way to stay safe, to keep everything under control. This is a very, very valuable type of thing. After the move of rook to e8, ultimately, white played knight x to the c6, and he was wrong. He was so wrong. He thought that he could stabilize and consolidate everything, but it wasn't the case. On the contrary, it was something different. And I actually like to tell you this. What is so important is that when you get under pressure, under initiative, you evaluate two things. The first thing that I find is very valuable is that we get to think a little bit more regarding, okay, what will be the opponent's actual follow-up? So is there going to be anything dangerous, anything strong, anything threatening? Now that's the first thing. And then the second thing that you'd like to find out, which I think is necessary, is to find out, okay, how a player could actually stabilize his position. It was very, very important to discover that. Now, I believe that white was not thinking enough about that, considering that he thought it may be a lot easier for him to just exchange, simplify the position, get everything in place, and then just, you know, enjoy a pretty good game. That's what he wanted. I mean, and sort of, he thought that he can get this very easily. Now, what is so important about this position is that after rook e8, white played knight x to the c6, giving black the initiative. So as the initiative is taken by black, everything goes completely wrong and terribly in the wrong way. So that actually is a very, very bad idea. I have to tell you that knight x to the c6 on its own was one of the worst moves to be played. I think white should have just played knight f3 to solidify, to consolidate, and then do everything right. With knight x to the c6, it wasn't working. Let's see what you could have done. You could have sacrificed the pawn, but then get the chance to play d4. And after a few of the possible exchanges, perhaps white would have been able to play with d5, just to push back black's knight, and, well, stay well. Don't think that it's perfect, but at least you'd be able to keep most of the black pieces kind of backward, and everything was going to be good. It was going to be quite okay. So I think white didn't realize that. So actually, after knight x to the e4, d4, even though black would have actually taken back the material, this was better for white. Otherwise, after knight x to the c6 and d x to the c6, things are going a little bit differently. Now, I'd like to explain to you a couple of other things that you have to remember. Okay, so just pay attention, pay strong attention. After the capture that happened with d takes to the c, white did bishop c4, hoping to get the bishop on an active position and keep it there. It was a decent move. It was pretty okay, just playing like that and keeping it together. Now, what do you think black is supposed to do in this position? What is black's best opportunity to fight and try to get some control, or better, more powerful possibilities? I'd like to hear your suggestions. Think about this very carefully. This is a very, very important question. Okay, now, the whole thing in this type of position is that as soon as white played the move of bishop to the c4, black didn't care about taking the pawn. Now, you have to understand that one of the very negative emotions in chess is getting an impulsive feel of a move. You see, oh, this is a great pawn, let's take it. We see it, we play it, and we realize it really wasn't the right thing to do. See, so one of the things is you have to check carefully. Just think about these type of possibilities and see, am I ready to do so? If you feel ready, if you are okay, do it. No problem. But if you do this quickly, this is not going to work. So instead of playing with knight takes to d4, which would have actually resulted in bishop takes f7 and queen f3, black decided to play b5. So I will give you, in order to make sure you avoid such type of possibilities, such unpleasant resources, try to make sure you push the opponent back. You make him go backward. You make him lose quite a bit of his control. So this is a very, very good idea. When we do the move of pawn to the b5, we're able to ultimately force the opponent's bishop to go away. And I think that is a very necessary type of position. After pawn to b5, if white plays back with the bishop on b3, black would get bishop g4. And now you can understand that, in fact, losing material is not as bad as it may sound. In fact, it gives a lot of strong possibilities. Like bishop g4, b4, rook takes d4, and white would almost be losing. Probably what was the better thing for him to do, but still, this looks great for black. So white played bishop to the e2. He just wanted to escape and move to a safer position. When black takes the pawn, regaining the material equality. And now we see bishop f3 doesn't work due to the exchange, queen and queen d4. The initiative turns out really amazing, as black is able to use basically every single piece to move forward and create some beautiful checkmating attacks. In case of knight e4, there's an exchange, and then possibly the way to go with something kind of like queen takes f2, so we can realize white is in a deep trouble, in deep danger. So that doesn't work either. And so we played with knight takes to d4, rook takes d4, and in the position bishop f3. Perhaps by exchanging, a lot of the pressure that black was able to keep or maintain with his pieces is going to be gone, right? Well, at least that's what he's thinking. Black played rook e6, and now white made c3. Now you have to understand that the secret for the successful attack is to find out your opponent's best defenses. The secret of the successful defense is to find out your opponent's best attacking moves. If you miss to do that, however good and nice looking and important your move may look, it's not going to work, or likely it's not supposed to work. The reason why white played c3 was because he wanted to play d4, and he was kind of really thinking about this great feel of like, I have the opportunity to break through with the move of pawn up to the d5. I can do this, and I can feel amazing with that. Now, think. The strength of your move always depends on your opponent's ability to respond it. This means if your opponent has an opportunity to respond that move to counter you or do certain things, it doesn't matter how good the move would look. It didn't matter that the c3 move just felt like a nice idea. It really doesn't. The truth of the matter is that the sooner that pawn pushes on the c3, black got queen to the d3. Thereby, white should have just played d3. It's not a great position, but I suppose it's not supposed to be a great position. It's just after d3, you would have actually had this chance to complete the development and stay alright, which is, I guess, his main goal in the position, we could say. Yeah. Definitely. That would have been the right way to go. Simple, straightforward, and okay as a good move. See, people allow their emotions to lead them through the decision making, and this is a huge mistake. If you don't want to do this mistake, if you want to always be aware of what can happen and what you can do in a given position, make sure you ask yourself, what are my opponent's important, threatening moves and possibilities that he could use to create threats? That will make a real difference in the game. This is important. So after that, of course, after c3, black plays queen up to the d3. And that is a brilliant move. It blockades white's d4 pawn. And so white played b4. Another important thing is, you know how most chess players think? They try to calculate, and then based on that calculation, find out the most relevant ideas for the position. And while sometimes this may work, and most times it doesn't. For this reason, I'd like to give you this suggestion. When you analyze, or rather when you think, try to remember that you have to first come up with the ideas of the position based on which you will guide your calculation. You cannot do it the other way around. I feel the problem was that white was really thinking a bit more about the calculation, b4, a4, whatever, instead of thinking about the plan. And his major plan should have been to just exchange the important pieces of black. With more traits available, there would have been less pieces for black to keep up and do and follow. That would have been an excellent idea to play with. It was a good thinking. It really was. Unfortunately, didn't work like that. What really happened was that there was b4, bishop to b6, a4, bishop b takes to a, queen takes a4, and now black played bishop d7. Would have been a good idea for black to play bishop b7 to cover the a6 square so that the white queen doesn't challenge. And yet, white never had the right plan. See, the plan is the most important thing. Because ultimately, when you have the right plan, you can guide your calculation, you can guide your analysis and choose to do it the right way. If you don't, now I want to really mention that, you'll be thinking about moves that may not be even that irrelevant or that important at all. So, secret rule number 1 is whatever you do, especially if you're in a more of a tactical position of this kind, always think about, okay, what's my goal? What am I trying to achieve? Based on that, you will decide which candidate moves are most relevant and which one you have to basically go with. That's how you'd like to think about it. This is the key concept. This is the key idea. And I like to mention this is that how important it is to make it so relevant and good. With the bishop to the d7, rook a2 here, white was never aware of the value of queen a6 until a move later. But then black found this incredible queen takes f3 move, which really shatters the whole position that white has. It's a completely shattering move. It's really killing him. And everything that white has been fighting for, it's great. It was great. G takes f, rook g6. Now black sacrificed the queen, but then we can see that all the white pieces are pretty much discoordinated. All of them are not playing together. And this is more than enough to guarantee the victory. After bishop h3, white cannot do rook g1 due to the exchange and the checkmate to follow. And of course, if it plays with something like queen d3, there's f5, and really that's just too bad. Like rook d1, check, check, bishop takes d1. I don't believe the white's can condition to stop the pieces. All of that is being made because instead of trying to rely on a plan, white relied purely on calculations. Something similar happened in the game as black played a couple of different checks. And then he played bishop takes f2. And now the most important lesson that you can learn from. And you see, what is the most important lesson of such a position? Don't think about how you can destroy the opponent. That is a very positively negative emotion. It means positively because like you like it. You like to think about destroying. But negative because oftentimes our thoughts and ideas connected with winning are simply unrealistic. So we like to checkmate him and destroy him quickly, and that doesn't work. Instead, it's a lot more realistic to think about, okay, right now, what is the way to keep the pressure? Knowing that the breakthrough is somewhere out there, knowing that you will do it in the right time, how do I get to keep the pressure more? That's what really matters, and that's what Black did do. I mean, White was actually in trouble. He couldn't defend against Bishop G2 except Queen F1, and of course now after the exchange, Black is dominating with the 2 rooks and the bishop in the endgame. The checkmate is clear after rook takes h. I think this game very well illustrates the negative versus positive emotions and how to think about it when it comes down. So, I hope this makes sense and you can realize the effect of the emotions during a practical game. Good luck, and I hope this serves you in the next game.